let's just stay home and watch football. Let's just do that. And then it just kind of, went away.
It's understandable. It's understandable. I mean, my experience was Lutheran. I grew up Lutheran, so some people are like, it's like Catholic light, and Martin Luther, right? Who people attribute with the founding of Lutheranism in a sense. That's why it's named after him. Even though he didn't really start it, it was his followers that kind of did. Right. He stayed Catholic. He remained Catholic. He just wanted to see reform. And there were certain principles that he thought, well, we've kind of left and we need to come back to, and so I grew up in the German Lutheran tradition because like my triple great grandfather came over from Germany in like 1882, like exactly 100 years before I was born, and settled about 40 miles south of here to farm, and amongst a German immigrant community there. So yeah, they brought that whole tradition of German Lutheranism over. Very, very strong. I mean, they still would do services in German. I actually have copies of my great-grandfather's confirmation certificate, like going through confirmation class and all that, and my grandfather's confirmation, as well as his baptism certificates, and they're written in German.
Oh, nice.
Like, it's amazing. They're artistically done. I mean, it's really, really, really cool to have a hold of those. But, yeah, I mean, like, my great-grandma, Bertha, she spoke German and taught the kids German in the house and everything like that. So my grandfather and all his brothers and sisters, they were brought up with that. But it's very interesting to understand some of those faith traditions, like where my family history comes from in relation to faith. What part that's played in my being here now. Right. So. Yeah, I did the altar boy thing. I did the candles, the acolyte, I think is what we called it.
The little ringing of the bell?
We didn't do a bell.
You guys didn't have a bell?
Well, we did a bell, but it wasn't I think in some churches I've been to, they had a bell. Not all churches had done that.
Okay. In Catholic, that's a heavy thing.
Yeah.
If you're the bell guy, you're top notch.
Well,
altar
exactly,
boy.
Right? We didn't have the hierarchy in that. I think one of the elders of the church would do the bell, in places that I've been to that had one. Yeah, it's interesting because I wanted to learn more about the history of my family's faith background, and I also have an appreciation of that as I grew up. It caused me to want to more personalize all of this, like to not just believe something, but know why I believe it, or if I do it all, right? Am I going to intellectually be consistent here? So I've done a ton of research into it. Like I asked questions about stuff when I was younger, like why do we believe this? How do we know the Bible's true? All of these different kinds of things. What is science in the Bible? How do they differ? How do they coincide? Are there any points on this? So I just dug into that stuff, and now my understanding has certainly changed from when I was a kid growing up, but it's probably more passionate and more deep than it was before then. Like, I feel like I've gotten a better handle on whatever the truth is. Not that I don't understand it completely, but I feel like I'm a lot more close to it. And so if I have any religious practices that I engage in, it's like because I personally connect with it and I really want to do it. So it's not like someone's telling me, you're going to hell if you don't do this. It's like, no, I do it because I have that relationship with the creator of the universe. Right. So that's my motivation.
Right. And just to clear the deck here,
please.
I do believe in a higher power.
I figure you did.
I know that we didn't this fucking book being here right now. I know that it's a reason. There's a reason. It's not just
World
Big
War
Bang.
Z.
Yeah, well, or any of these fine books in my collection.
Yes.
But I was that kid in religion class and all the way through high school, and I would just completely frustrate my religion teachers by,
of course,
bringing up things like you and I talked about that one night when I was drunk over at my parents.
Oh my gosh, that was a great conversation.
And I would just bring up, and I'd be like, okay, so first of all, the ark, to have two of everything. First of all, the world doesn't work like that.
Seven of the clean. Don't forget that one. Most people forget. It was two of most of the animals, but then all the ones that were considered clean animals, there were 7 of them.
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah. Most people missed that one.
See, I was the one that was just, and I would just keep pushing my teacher until I'd eventually be told to go sit out in the hall until class is over.
They're going by the curriculum. Right?
It's just like, how can you believe that? I mean, because how old was Noah? Wasn't he like 890 years old? 600 years old.
Yeah, by the time he hit the ark.
By the time, 600 years old. I didn't know that people lived that long. First of all, and then second of all, how did he build a boat big enough to house that many animals? Like I was just the walking on water, raising from the dead. Like if it was a new thing and I had to listen to it, I would argue it.
You want rationale. You don't just want it's this.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's what I was consistently told of through grade school. I went to a Catholic high school. My teacher in high school was a little bit more, I don't know, open-minded to the argument. I never had to go sit out in the hall, but I just wanted somebody to just not be like, look, this is the book, this is what it says, this is why you believe it. I was like, no, I need to know.
That's indoctrination.
I want more than that.
Yeah, and I understand that's like that's the method, of a lot of different religious faiths. That's how they instruct. Like, no, this is what we believe. This is how.
Right.
I've always been like you, where I'm like, I want to understand the why. I want to understand what is. How do we know? Right. There's like a concept in, I guess, the way they teach things in seminaries and different stuff. They call hermeneutics. Right, which hermeneutics is just a big fancy Greek word, which means the method by which you interpret what you're looking at. Right. How do you go about interpreting the meaning and understanding it? And then there's a term called exegesis, which means what does the text say? What is it actually saying? And then there's exposition, which is what does it mean? Right. Like once you understand what it says, how do you understand what the message is that it's trying to convey? Right. And so it's cool once you recognize that, say, that book was largely penned by people of a Hebrew background, and you understand a little bit about that culture historically.
Right.
The way that they think is fundamentally different from the way that we, as descendants of a Greco-Roman, westernized, Hellenized culture, think. Right. We're focused on, like, okay, if a I guess, Western Greek-minded person looked at this pen that I'm holding up, how would you describe this pen?
You mean the physical traits of it, or what it does?
What would be your first thing to say? If I say, hey,
I would say that's
a
a utensil that you use to write down your thoughts on paper.
Well, see, then you're thinking like a Hebrew, because a Hebrew would say the purpose of the device, usually our tendency is to think about what it looks like. We're more interested in the form more often than the function. But Hebrew is so set up to think about function rather than form, so much so that their word order in sentences is along that line. Like they're going to put the verb before the subject. Like, say, the very first verse of the Bible in what we would call the book of Genesis, what they would say is the book of Bereshit, right? The book of the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? In Hebrew, that's Bereshit bara Elohim et ha-shamayim ve'et ha-aretz, right? So, Bereshit bara, Bereshit, in the beginning, bara, created Elohim, God, right? So they put what God did before they put God.
Gotcha.
Right? We would say God created in English, right?
Gotcha.
That's just the way that we order things. So the verb, the action word, is before even the subject, right?
Okay.
Which is kind of one of those characteristics of the language. They're very focused on what something does.
Well, and another part that I absolutely could not get around, because this book was written by all these men that were, touched by the hand of God to be able to put all these stories into form. I was like, man, we treated girls back then pretty awful.
A lot of people did. A lot of people did.
I mean,
no argument there.
And it was just, I had a hard time going from history class to religion class and then to like PE. I couldn't handle the swings, because here in history I'm hearing about all these awful things like fucking slavery, how the Roman Empire was like built and then fallen basically because a bunch of dudes were blowing each other. Like, I mean, homosexuality was rampant in Roman times because women were so devalued that they only felt like other. So I'm learning like all this stuff, like not only just from books like history books. Obviously, my Catholic history books.
You're saying that was the way that they preached history in Catholic school.
That's just how. And I mean, not even that. Like, I would always, if you're given if you're giving a writing assignment, our teachers would always write, just some vague things that you could choose from on the board. I would always go out and like be like, all right, I want to know what the Roman Empire was like. And then I'd do my own research outside of school and stuff.
Excellent.
Go down to the library, learn about like how the Roman Empire, and then I would go to religion class after getting a D on a very well-written paper, but because I was in Catholic grade school, I was pointing out all these, historical facts that contradict Catholicism. So I constantly got bad grades on my papers because I was going against the grain. I once wrote a paper about how I thought that, affirmative action was unfair. I had a black teacher, and I was writing a paper because she was like, I want to challenge you to write a paper that you don't believe in, but you need to present it to me in a fashion that I could see your point. So I chose affirmative action. Everybody else chose like, I don't know, pollution and boring shit. Sure. So I chose to write that paper. Knowing full well that my teacher was black, and I made that argument. I did a hell of a job doing it, little notes and everything. Got a D on it because she felt like the affirmative action was a good step in the right direction. I was like, that wasn't the point of the assignment.
Right.
I would always get in little arguments like that with my teachers constantly. And I would have a really hard time being like, okay, back then these men were so great, but probably most of them treated women, and
there's a lot of that. Yes,
me and my kids, we were just talking about Martin Luther King and civil rights and women rights and how long ago did women earn the right to vote?
Yeah, in our country,
absolutely. In our country, earn the right to vote when women are all we want. Like, we should have been glorifying women as opposed to being like, oh, they're just things.
Yes, I agree. And there's a little more dynamic to that argument, too. I would highly recommend checking out there's a woman named Karen Strawn who has a YouTube channel called Girl Writes What? And she's very, very educated on the entire suffrage movement at that period in history and understanding some more of the dynamics to it, because it's not quite a clear and cut sort of discussion. There's a lot of nuance to that, and a lot of the responsibilities that came with suffrage. There are a lot of women who didn't even want it back then. Like, there was a small movement of the population who was actually fighting for it, and a lot of women didn't even want it because of a lot of the things that went along with it that they were going to now be required.
You have to be responsible. Yeah. Right. I mean, okay.
Just like you get to vote, you're going to have some of the same responsibilities that guys have,
right,
within the country, like
go get a
job, fire duty, like volunteer firefighter kind of stuff, or involved in that in some way, shape, or form. And I'm not as knowledgeable on that as she is, but she's definitely a resource to check out.
But that was also because of so many years where women, women were treated like a house cat. You were basically in some cultures today, women are still treated that way.
Mm-hmm. There are those who would do that, and it's a lot. So we usually get talked to about the large segment that did that because it's bad. The bad stuff will shine very brightly.
Right.
There were a lot of people who treated women like gold, right? Who elevated them to a position of massive importance. I mean, women can generate children, right? They can birth other human beings. We can't do that.
And that's because we want to be with them, and they're
We each have qualities the other one may not have, right? We have value that the other one may not have, and by ourselves, there's far less we can accomplish when we find a way to work harmoniously, right, with those differences. That's what's awesome, right? And so I think there's some people that go to an extreme to say, well, it's like they want to elevate one above the other, and I think both of those are dangerous.
Sure.
But it's definitely interesting to look at, like, when you're talking about biblical background and that kind of thing, the way that it's probably been taught in your Catholic upbringing and stuff. I think there are probably things that weren't highlighted for you that ought to have been. I can at least speak from my own background.
Yeah,
there are a lot of things that I didn't know about that were negative, to women, for example, that I wish had been highlighted more. And a lot of things that were awesome for women. An example of that, Old Testament stuff. Most, I think, Christians probably tend to regard that as like, well, that's the Old Testament. It's not as important kind of stuff for us today. There are groups of Christians. Some people view them more cult-like, but there are groups of Christians that view the Old Testament stuff as still very relevant when understood in context, even like to live it out in some ways. Like, for example, like not eating pork, right? Like there are Christian people who think that that's worthwhile. I'm one of those. I tend not to eat pork anymore.